Page 268 of The Unfolding is the story of Dr. Henry Cloud.
I couldn't deny that he was real anymore, but at the same time, I learned a big lesson that summer was God can be very real and very present with you and know exactly where you are, and you're not getting healed.
God's story has been unfolding.
Since the beginning of time.
He invites you to be a part of it.
Wow. Another page in The Unfolding.
Have you ever wondered why you can love God and follow Him and still feel stuck in the same unhealthy patterns? Hey, this is Meredith Foster. On this episode of The Unfolding, you'll hear the story behind a man whose work has helped millions build healthier lives and relationships, but whose own healing had to go much deeper before he could help anyone else. For decades, Dr. Henry Cloud has been known worldwide as a leadership expert, clinical psychologist, and New York Times bestselling author. You probably know him from his book Boundaries, which is just one of his 40-plus books that have sold more than 20 million copies. But what you may not know is that Henry's journey didn't start with answers. It started with buried trauma, with depression, and with the realization that you can't perform your way out of pain, spiritually or otherwise. In this conversation, Henry shares how unhealed wounds shaped his relationships, his faith, and how God used deep, honest healing to not only restore him, but to shape his calling in a way that would impact millions of others.
Well, I grew up in a small southern town, really, I'd say small southern city, because it was kind of more of a city than town, in Vicksburg, Mississippi. It was kind of just what we would consider normal southern upbringing. Our family, people always say you should go over to a Christian home. Yes, but today when you use the word Christian home, it means a little more ballistic than my house. We were kind of like, my parents were like the normal churchgoers, but really had a deep faith. I mean, they actually lived out their faith in really deep ways in service. They were always in service to the poor. My father we have a family business and really used it in so many ways in service of the poor. And I saw that my whole life, but we didn't have Bible verses on the walls and, on the napkins and daily devotional. We didn't have that, but, went to church, prayers before bedtime. God was always someone that we knew was there. But as a little kid, I always felt a real connection to God from when I was little, as far back as I can remember. And that was, it was real. The big kind of God anchor, I think, in the narrative of when I was a child was I always knew about this story. And the story was, I'm floating along as a normal 3.5-year-old. Right before my 4th birthday, apparently I started screaming in the night with leg pain, and it got pretty bad. They took me to the hospital. I was in the hospital for about a month. They couldn't diagnose it.
Wow.
At some point, somehow they started talking about amputation, and there was an appointment where my mother took me to the doctor for that appointment, not to cut it off, but they were going to talk about it. And she was in the waiting room. The doctor was late, and she said she heard a very clear voice that said, "Get up and leave and take him to a specific hospital in New Orleans, which was over 200 miles away."
Wow.
And she couldn't deny it. And her friend that was with her, she said, "We got to go." And they're like, "What?" Somehow she talks my otherwise pretty reasonable father into this. They get in the car and drive to New Orleans to Osher's Clinic. It's a big training hospital, sort of the Mayos of the South at that time. And I get randomly assigned, I didn't even have a doctor. I get randomly assigned to this woman, orthopedic surgeon, who had just moved there from Chicago. She does the x-rays, the films, does the exam, all that, calls them back in. And sorry, this one still gets to me. She said, "Well, there'll be no amputation." She said, "I know exactly what this is, and I know how to treat it, and he'll be in a wheelchair, and in leg braces for quite a while. It's about a year and a half, going on to 2 years, and he'll be fine. Well, it just so happened that doctor had just moved there from Chicago, where she was trained by the two doctors that had figured this all out.
Wow.
And that wasn't random. So I always kind of knew the story that God somehow saved my leg.
Hmm.
And then, just childhood continued. I kind of overcompensated from being a crippled child, was sort of what I was called. That's the crippled one. And went headlong into sports, I guess, sort of, to kind of prove that I wasn't. And just continued. Played a lot of sports. About the age of, it would have been still in elementary school, I figured out golf was my calling. And so I started playing competitive golf, and through high school, was recruited to play in college. I went to college, and my faith was kind of like somewhere inside of me, but it wasn't in the forefront at all. I always felt like, growing up, I had a connection with God, but I didn't like his friends. I liked God. I just thought his friends were weird.
What do you mean by his friends? By churchy
Well,
people?
the churchy types,
Uh-huh.
they didn't go to the prom, and there was a lot of stuff. And my normal friends, who really weren't people of faith, they're the ones I most connected with. And so I kind of was in this private netherland
Mhm.
in between the two. And that's sort of where I was. I wasn't as good as the good ones. I wasn't as bad as the bad ones, but that's kind of where I found myself. So, but I had a real faith, but really golf was my God. That's
What do you mean by that?
well, that's all I did, and all I was striving for, and playing, competitively throughout the South, and every day, 14 hours. And that's what I was pursuing. And then I went to college, and I had a wrist injury right early on, and I really struggled for a couple of years with a lot of pain, and wasn't playing well. And finally, it all came to an end. And when that happened, I got severely depressed, kind of non-functionally depressed. It was really bad. And
Did you know that's what did you recognize I'm depressed?
well, I wouldn't know the clinical term for it. I was 19 years old,
Mhm.
or 20 years old, I guess. I just knew my life had ended. I was so depressed. I went through the days, but just felt just awful. Like, I had all the, if I'd been a psychologist, I would have hospitalized me. But,
Wow.
I was trying to limp through.
Mhm.
And then finally I went home that summer, and I couldn't limp through anymore, and I had to take a semester off school. But what had happened in the spring, when all that was happening, I'd broken up with a girlfriend who was a great, great gal, and I'd lost my golf dream. I didn't know what I was going to do with my life. I was an accounting and finance major, but that was because you got to major in something when you're playing golf. I'm sitting there on my bed one day in the dorm. I was sitting there just obsessing about how do you find a relationship that works? How do you find a career? How am I going to make a living? What am I going to study? What's my purpose? How do you get undepressed? And I'm obsessing about all this stuff. And for some reason, which I know now, I looked up at my bookshelf, and I saw my Bible there, which I had not read since I'd been in college. It kind of, it's a weird thing, but out of all the books, it sort of like kind of drew me to it. I said, well, whatever. I pick it up, I open it up, and it falls to a verse. It says, "Seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all these things shall be added to you as well." And I kept reading, it's all the things of life that you worry about. And I go, wait a minute. You look for God, and that's how this stuff, what is it? Okay. Well, nothing else is working. So I felt like, all right, I'm going to give my life to God. And then all these things will
It'll all get better.
It'll all get better. So I figured you can't do this in a dorm room, right? So I actually walked across campus to an empty chapel on a wintry Sunday afternoon, dark in the chapel, went down to the altar, knelt, and asked God to help me. And it's really interesting. Nothing happened. Like I was expecting, I've seen people on TV when they do this, they get slayed in the spirit or something. I was the one to get zapped and nothing happened. I remember that moment is probably kind of like the loneliest moment of my life because I had reached out to God. I finally jumped out of the plane and the parachute didn't open. I mean, and it felt, oh no, there's nothing left after this because he was always in reserve, I thought. And I got up and I actually think I said something like, well, call me. It's like, I don't even know if you're there, but I need help. So I go back to my dorm room and a little while later, the phone rings and it was a fraternity brother of mine. And he said, I don't know why I thought of you. You're the last person I would think of to invite to something like this, but we're having a Bible study in the fraternity house. And he invited me. And that's kind of when it all started.
Did you think when you hung up the phone from that phone call, did you connect that with your walk
Yeah.
to the chapel? You thought it was,
Yeah. Now, what did I know for sure? But I thought, hey, I asked. He's the phone rings.
the phone rang. You called.
Okay. But I was looking anyway, so I guess I would have gone, if I didn't connect it. But it was pretty clear. And what progressed from there, I actually wrote a book on my entire story last year called Why I Believe. And the book was, I have a lot of non-Christian friends, a lot. And they know I'm one of those weirdos, but they kind of go, yeah, you're one of those. We're still friends anyway. But there's some people, that conversation is really difficult for some people. It gets very divisive and they think, if you're a Christian, that means 15 other things.
Right.
And it's just, extended families have this problem, workplace people have this problem, and I had this problem. How do I talk to my friends that are going to, go nuclear? And I thought, but still, I want to. And so I thought about it, and I'm going to write a book about why I believe this stuff. So I wrote that book. And the journey, the subtitle of the book is A Psychologist's Thoughts on Suffering, Miracles, Science, and Faith, because that was my path. It started in suffering. Then I go into a whole section about the miracles that I've seen and witnessed and seen God's reality. But then when I came to faith, it brought up a lot of intellectual quandaries. And that section is about how all those doubts and questions were answered for me. And then the last one is, I write a lot about the sciences, but there's one area of science that I can claim real, expertise in, and that's the science of psychology. And that section is about how the science of psychology proved the Bible to be true for me. And so that's sort of how the story started.
So the guy calls you and invites you to come to the Bible study at the fraternity.
Yeah.
And that began to give you a community to walk through. I mean, you're still struggling with depression, still asking questions about what am I supposed to be, where and what's my purpose?
Yeah, the first thing was, I was just looking for help. I wasn't trying to become a theologian by any means, but I was just looking for help. But in that community, I started to experience some kind of reality that I hadn't experienced before. And I started to kind of sense this stuff is really real. And so we're basically going through what a normal Bible study would do. But the guy that was leading it, he was a seminary student, and he was also having us do some pretty deep discipleship kinds of work, which really is a lot about processing your life. And so, long story short, I remember after about a month, I'm still so depressed, and I asked him to go to lunch, and I said, I like what I'm learning about God, but I'm still depressed. And I remember he said something that day. He said, well, keep coming because God uses people too. And I thought, well, that's a lame answer. I want to get zapped. What do you mean God uses people too? Well, I went home that summer, and that's when I did experience the beginning of what's been decades now of miracles that I've seen. And there was no doubt that summer when I was without anybody around that God actually did there was some zapping that happened and some things that happened. And I couldn't deny that he was real anymore. But at the same time, I learned a big lesson that summer was God can be very real and very present with you and know exactly where you are, and you're not getting healed. And I didn't know anything else to do but stay in the process. And then he led me into some, a lot of experiences that we would call therapeutic, that involved a lot of people, a lot of him, and a lot of the whole process of how we get better. But I remember about a year later, I woke up one morning, and now I had this new spiritual life and community, was involved in all this stuff, and was in counseling, and I woke up and I realized, whoa, I'm not depressed anymore. And I looked up at God and I said, this is really cool. And then I said, but I wish you had done it. So then I opened up my Bible and there's this verse, and it says, from him the whole body, being held together and joined together by the ligaments and sinews, heals itself as each part of the body does its work. And I realized God had put me into the healing processes that are all chronicled in the New Testament, but it was through a lot of those processes with people with different gifts that he had healed me. And then I had to repent and say, oh, I guess you did do it. See, I thought getting zapped was plan A and this people thing was plan B. But then I found out from the scriptures, well, he gave me plan A all along. That's how he designed it. And there are instantaneous healings. I've seen those. I've experienced a lot of that. But this process of that the New Testament talks about how broken hearts are healed, how strengthening the arms that are feeble and the knees that are weak, help the weak, be patient with all, confront the unruly, and all of these things we got to do actually to get better. I figured out God did do this. And then along the way, he told me to change my major and go into the field of psychology, which I knew nothing about. So it's like Abraham left Ur not knowing where he was going. I changed my major not knowing where I was going, but it was a definite, very clear direction from God. And I just took one step and that led to another. And here we are.
There is a story. This is back in that summer when you were at home and things were so bad, where you decided you wanted to go to the pastor's house.
Yeah.
And God led you turn by turn. Do you mind sharing that? I just think one of the things I found so fascinating about that is that you were still in a place of being broken, and he's showing up.
It was the worst. It was actually worse that summer than it had been in school, because now I went back home and I'm isolated without any of my, group or anybody around me, really.
And he still doesn't zap you, but he does something really, obviously confirming to you that he's real.
Yeah. Yeah. What happened was, we went to kind of a normal church, but there was this evangelist in town, or he was doing an evangelistic week or something. And I went to that church, and these are the people who actually believed in healing, and all that stuff. I guess they read their Bibles. And I thought, and I was too ashamed to go forward, but I wanted to talk to the pastor, and then I couldn't get to him. And then it would have been Monday, I guess. The churches are closed the next day. But I really felt like I needed to talk to that pastor. And so I asked my father, do you know where that guy lives by chance? And he goes, no, but somewhere north of town, I think he named a development out there, and I think he's out there somewhere. So I got in the car and I asked God to take me to him. Mm. And I don't know how to describe this, but I started driving, and at each turn, I would just feel like turn there and turn there and turn there. And I'm talking like 20 plus 25 minutes from where we lived across town. And in this massive subdivision where there's, a gazillion streets and all this, and I'm just following these promptings. And then I get to this corner and I stop and I feel like go right, and I turn right, and I looked up, and there is his name on the mailbox. And I went up and knocked on the door, and that led to the next step. But I've had even crazier stuff than that happen since then.
What I think is interesting about that particular moment in your life is how broken you felt, how desperate you were, and he still didn't zap you. It was still like process, but he's also show you. So for you, you're carrying I'm still broken, and yet you're doing these miraculous things. It was enough to keep you following him, I guess.
Well, not only keep me following, but think about it. What what I learned when I started to get undepressed was that I was a pretty, I mean, I was a real people person. I mean, I was always out there in golf tournaments and parties and in my fraternity and lots of friends. But there's a difference in being a people person and being really emotionally connected in ways you need to be connected, especially from areas that are wounded. And plus, I found out in the process, I had a lot of trauma that, you know, we can talk about if you want to go into, but I didn't know all that. I was fine until all this stuff happened. And then what I realized later was, yeah, God could have zapped me, to your point, healed the depression, and then you've got a non-depressed, detached, traumatized, still got pus inside from all these wounds. You've got an undepressed, really screwed up person walking around. And that's probably the last thing we would want. And so it's sort of like, you know, if somebody, I had two knee replacements in the past few years. It'd be like if somebody healed the knee pain, or if God healed the knee pain, but I still got two unusable knees. God's after healing all of us, not just the symptom. And actually, as a psychologist, I can tell you, symptoms are there for a reason. And it's like a fever. You don't have a fever. A doctor doesn't just say, I'm going to kill your fever, medicate your fever away without going, well, where's that coming from? And what I found out later was a lot, way more than I wanted to have to deal with.
When did you begin to realize that depression that you had been through wasn't just a symptom? And what prompted you to begin to dig up the trauma? How did that come about?
Well, I didn't have any choice. I had to go to therapy. I mean, the guy that was leading the Bible study, who was in seminary, was also taking some counseling courses at Dallas Seminary, is where he was, and there was a psychiatrist there who was teaching it, and he got me in to see him, and that's when I started to learn, that this has got some deep stuff in it, and I think probably if there was a moment where I really got it, that, oh gosh, this is way worse than I thought. I had been in a wheelchair as a young child, but I had skated past that. After I could walk again, I was back at life. But that had left a lot of stuff that never had been touched. And it would have been the fall of that. Remember, I took that fall semester off, and right around the beginning of the Christmas holidays, a Christmas Carol was showing on TV. With Tiny Tim and
Scrooge and the whole thing.
Scrooge and Bob Cratchit. So we're sitting there watching it, and Tiny Tim walks on the stage. Still, I'm not in pain. It just always moves me because of what God did. But Tiny Tim walks on the stage, and all of a sudden, I started hyperventilating. We're just watching a movie. I started hyperventilating, and I'm having flashbacks just take over my whole head of X-ray machines and bright lights and hospitals and people in white coats. And I realized there's a lot more trauma here for that time period. Apparently, there was a lot of pain. I don't remember I do remember I had pain. I don't remember as bad as they say it was, but there was just a lot. Anyway.
Had you ever had, I don't know if that was a panic attack but had you ever had an experience?
No.
That was the first time. Yeah. So it had been buried deep.
I had been very depressed that year, but I never had any flashbacks or, what we call PTSD symptoms before then. It did kind of give me a few things to work on, which actually, as I talk about in the book, all of that didn't even get resolved until way later at even deeper levels. There were having a lot to do with relationship patterns, stuff like that.
So that was in that same fall that you'd taken off that semester, and now you've
Yeah.
realized this is a lot deeper and there's a lot more roots going down underneath this than what you thought. What was the process? You had a community around you?
We had a community and had a group and had a good shrink and just doing really a lot of, it's interesting. I don't know how to explain it, but the spiritual community that I was in, without being weird, they were going deep,
Mm.
and the equivalent of things like deep life inventories and forgiveness processes and really just learning a lot about how much my whole life had been trying to perform my way out of pain. You win golf tournaments to feel better, like any other, attempt at medicating ourselves. And I had to learn so many relational patterns that just had to be changed. It was a incredible couple of years with that community.
As you're talking about that, I think what many people come to you for is help in getting their relationships in a healthier place and dealing with
Yeah.
relationships in a much healthier way. And had you not walked through this process, I think it's interesting to look back now that that's part of, you've been through it. And so you're able to offer
Yeah.
help in a really compassionate way.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's sort of like in the recovery circles. The 12th step is, having received the spiritual awakening, they go out and help others. But that's the 12th step. It's like, you don't want to send a really actively dysfunctional person out to help somebody, right? It's sort of like when you go, think about it this way. When you go to a surgeon, what does the surgeon do before he or she goes in the operating room? They scrub. They get the log out of their own eye first. They get their own germs, so they're not going to infect you. Secondly, they actually have read a few books about surgery, and you're not the first cadaver that they've carved on. And there's a team in there, and there's pain management and all this kind of stuff. Well, a lot of times, and I see this all the time, people are, they're hurting and they have these Christian friends that come along. They're like Job's friends. They give them all these pat answers, but they've never been through it themselves. And they're really imposing their own, a lot of times, denial systems onto the other person. And that's what a lot of that kind of the anti-counseling people do a lot of times. And if you just go through Job's friends' sermons, it's like a walk through a Christian bookstore, and they're the ones that God got mad at, right?
Mm-hmm.
But if you look at, what did they say? They said, you don't know his precepts well. Okay, get in the Word. You don't have enough faith. You don't trust him enough. You put the sin far away from you, and all these little formulas. And Job said, "Oh, I wish that your wisdom was silenced. In other words, shut up.
Mm-hmm.
This is not helping.
Mm-hmm.
You're worthless counselors."
Mm-hmm.
And not that people have bad intentions. It's just that if they've never been through it, Jesus said something profound one time. He said to the Pharisees, who really did a lot of that kind, we see that today. They thought, you know more of the Bible, you're more spiritual. Well, they knew it better than anybody. Clean up the outside of your life, stop doing it. Then and Jesus said to them, he said, you lay heavy burdens on men's shoulders without lifting them with so much as a finger, because you don't allow them to enter in because you haven't entered in yourself. And so if you want to go to a healer, go to somebody that actually knows something helpful. They're bringing something to the party because they've gotten the log out of their own eye first. And fortunately, from early on, I was with people like that. And later in my training, fortunately, I went to a school that in my doctoral program where you were required to have individual therapy and group therapy. And so it's hard to after you've been through that to kind of give people simple answers that don't work.
Mm-hmm.
And the interesting thing about all this, and I've written a lot of books about all of this for decades. This has been where I've hung out, is that if you know anything about me and my writings, you're not going to get very far in a paragraph without coming across scripture. But I was amazed when I really started to learn what healed people, that all of those processes are not only talked about in the Bible, they're prescribed in the Bible. But it's not the answers you hear in a lot of, quote, Christian pat answers. And it was just incredible to me how the scriptures spoke to this entire world of, that we talk about, quote, mental health problems, emotional problems, and all of that. But it's not the formulas that get popularized. It's really fascinating. But it's all in the scriptures. And Jesus said one time to the Pharisees, you're teaching the traditions of your elders, not the oracles of God. And so, in fact, John Townsend and I wrote a book one time called 12 Christian Beliefs That Will Drive You Crazy. And, either the Christian or beliefs is in quotes because they're things that you hear all the time in the church, but they're not in the Bible. In fact, the opposite is taught a lot of times. It's really weird.
I'm curious about how you've gone through this process of, I'll say, beginning healing, realizing, hey, I'm not depressed anymore. As you're going through that process, you're learning a lot about psychology. Along the way, you decide, I'm going to switch my major to this. That was really kind of a leap of faith. Did you know what you wanted to do with it? Or did you just know, I'm passionate about this and that's where I'm going to go?
No. It wasn't just out of interest. It had been a very clear direction from God.
Oh.
I'm supposed to go into this field, and if I'm going to go to this field, I'm going to have to go to graduate school, and you can't go to graduate school without having all the prerequisites, sort of like pre-med, all this stuff you need to get in. And so I halfway through knew that's where I was headed, but I had to change my major, get a couple of years of psychology hours. And then I took a year out and I worked in a psychiatric hospital unit. And that was profoundly valuable because by the time I went to graduate school, I had kind of seen everything they're talking about. And it was a lot better than just reading about it in a classroom, for the first time. And I had a lot of training fortunately, before I went to graduate school and kind of got started early.
Did you have an idea about what you were going to do? Or was this more like, this is the path I know I'm supposed to take? And
no, I did have a pretty clear idea. I wanted to be in private practice as a clinician. I didn't know where that would eventually go. I just wanted to practice, but I did have a mission statement that I wanted to understand how the scriptures and spiritual growth and faith affected all the areas that psychologists deal with. Mm. And so from day one, back then, and they still talk about it today, they talked about the integration of psychology and theology, which I always thought was a stupid idea because it was really weird. You have a problem and they'd look at you and go, well, this is an emotional problem. You need to go to a Christian counselor. No, this is a spiritual problem. You need to go to your pastor. Well, if my spiritual life can't affect my emotional issues, then what do we have, two gospels? It made no sense to me. The way I look at life is like a pie, I think. We all have three big slices in the life of pie, or the pie of life, I should say. Everybody has a big slice I call their clinical life. It's how you feel. Are you depressed, or you have energy? Are you stressed, or are you at peace? Are you bummed out, or are you happy and joyful? And we all, every day, somewhere, we go through seasons or periods, but we have a sense of well-being or not. And that's our clinical life, how we're doing. That's why you go to the doctor. You might go to get a physical. Hey, you're doing great. You might go to the doctor, you got to treat something. But we all have a clinical life. The second big piece is our relational life. And there's all sorts of relationships, marriage and family and, dating and extended family and work relationships. And we have to be able to function relationally well. And sometimes that's a big source of pain. And thirdly is our performance life. Everybody's got talents and gifts, but those ought to be ending up more than dreams. Those should be having results in the real world, being what the Bible calls fruitful. And to me, that's life. And everybody says, well, where's the spiritual piece? There's not a spiritual piece. That pie sits on a spiritual pan. The whole thing is spiritual. And our spiritual well-being affects how we feel, it affects how we relate, and it affects how we perform. And all of those are integrated. Your relationships can depress you. Your depression can affect your marriage. It can affect your performance. We are fearfully and wonderfully made, and God has when Jesus said, love God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength, well, there's the pie. And everybody focuses on the fruit, but he said, you got to focus on the tree.
Mm.
You got to get well who you are. And then a bad tree can't produce good fruit, and a good tree can't produce bad fruit. So back when I was really, really, really emotionally disconnected, how am I going to produce joy from a broken tree?
Mhm.
It just doesn't work. And so we find ways to try to get rid of that pain. But to me, there was never this division. What happens is there was one creation, and we're supposed to be thriving. God said it is all good. Then there was one fall, and every aspect of our being got infected with the fall. And then there was one redemption. And so my mission became to try to find out how does spiritual growth and faith in the gospel affect all of these areas of life. And it's kind of that's where I've been hanging out for a long time. But I never knew where it would go. I mean, that was, the Bible says that our path comes from our heart. God directs our steps. So I just took one step after another, and he opened new callings, new doors, but really all in the same mission.
Henry had learned how to stop performing his way out of pain, but experiencing real healing, that required something more. He would have to walk through the pain, not around it. And that led to freedom and his calling. You talked about going through that probably pretty intense period of healing, but I assume that there have been periods in your life, as you are an adult and through the years where you have to go back, and there are other things that you've dealt with. I'm just curious if there was, after that really intense period of healing for you, if you found that later in adulthood, there have been things that have come up that have been, all right,
Sure.
you have to shift and focus on that.
Yeah, there's an old booklet way back when. Everybody should read it. I read it when I was first starting out, called My Heart Cries Home. And it was a little drawing of a house. And a house has a lot of rooms in it. And, the process is over time, God keeps going into different wings of our house, different wings of our heart. And you see this in people's lives. Somebody can be going along very well, like somebody, falls in love and gets married, right? And the level of attachment, if you look at their heart, vertically, the level of attachment is sort of like, you hadn't been together long enough where those roots are going deep, 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 deep. And they get in the relationship, and the deeper the connection is, the deeper the relationship, that's going to call deeper parts of the heart. It's going to awaken them. Mm. And a lot of those deeper parts of the heart are where the fight or flight stuff lives, and the pain lives, and the don't get close to me, and the need fear dilemmas, and the controlling behavior, and all of that. And so life, over time, God is completing what he started. And so I think throughout life, there's no such thing as, oh yeah, I dealt with it, whatever it was, because there's a lot of it's that, some people are doing fine. I've treated people that were great until they have kids, and then all of a sudden they erupt into screaming at a 2-year-old and saying, where's this coming from? I mean, they thought they were nice people. But then all of a sudden, abuse surfaces so yeah, we certainly, for me, there were things that I had to deal with later, all that. So, and some of them really undeniable things that God did to heal those. It's interesting. One of the stories I tell in the book, and I would have been, this would have been late 20s probably. I was continuing my therapy from, in my training, and I was single, and there were, a few significant girlfriends that, not at once, but, one after the other, where the closer I got, the more depressed I could get. And I would just start to feel detached and, disinterested, break up, whatever. But I started to see this is a problem. And so I'm starting to explore that. And right in the middle of starting to explore that with my therapist at the time, right in the middle of that, I had a hernia and had to go in the hospital, for surgery. And as the surgery was approaching, I never had talked about all the, the stuff that happened as a kid. As the surgery was approaching, I was starting to get still a little anxious, about, and I had had 3 surgeries before then as an adult that I hadn't felt any, but this is later. Here it is, right? And I'm starting to feel this again. So I go in and I tell her about this, and we never had talked about the other stuff, and because I was way past that, and she said, well, what hospital experience did you have as a child? And so I started to tell her, and about that I was in this wheelchair, or the amputation story, and then I go see this doctor, and so in the course of my treatment, when I was in the wheelchair and on crutches, we had to drive 200 miles every week to see that doctor. And so she became like the center of my life. She was like a mother figure. And so I was explaining all that. And then my therapist said, she's such a big role in your life. Do you ever talk to her? I said, no, she died. And she said, oh, how did that happen? And I said, she was murdered. It was like she almost like came out of her seat, and she said her name was Mary Sherman, wasn't it? I said, yeah. How do you know that? She said, she was my best friend in residency. We started talking about it, and the loss of her, I never had. I mean, I think my mother wrote a note and left it in my room. Dr. Sherman died. That was it. Or maybe told me in passing or something. And she started pushing on this had to be a big deal, which I never had known. Okay, but I couldn't really remember. I was 4 or 5 years old. I couldn't remember a lot about her. So she starts bringing in pictures of them. Those are her best friends. She had a lot of pictures, and was able to reconstruct Dr. Sherman, and all of this stuff starts coming up, and all of this grief, and all of a sudden my pattern with getting close in a relationship and getting depressed was gone. And then
Wow.
I met Tori, and here we are 30 years of marriage later. But that was, you say, do you have to deal with stuff like, yeah, when it comes up, you deal with it. And sometimes things are there and sometimes it's not. But think of the miracle of, we're in Los Angeles. This is 20 something years later from when I was a kid. And he directs me, which is his own story, to this woman that wasn't even connected to the graduate school. This one woman who was able to do that. Probably not be married today. So anyway, there's a lot of stories about God's interventions that have been undeniable. I mean, even more overtly miraculous than that in my professional life.
I love that there is that sprinkling of stories of just miraculous things that happen, from turn by turn directions to a pastor who could say to you, you need clinical help. And,
Well, apart from the healing, you want to hear a funny one?
I do.
Or,
absolutely.
Well, it's not funny, but it will blow your mind. Well, here's another healing one that I didn't realize this. So when I'm in like the 7th grade, I'm giving an oral book report in class. Long story short, I kind of got flustered. I got nervous, and then I kind of really got nervous, and I couldn't even talk, and I had a meltdown. And the teacher just said, "Sit down." And then she says in front of the class, she goes, you'll never be successful in life if you can't speak in front of people. And she said, you said one day you might want to be a lawyer. Well, you'll never be a lawyer because you can't speak in front of people, and they have to do that. So you better find something else to do. Well, after that, I just wouldn't get up in front of a class and speak. And then I tried and I couldn't. And it got worse and worse and worse to where I literally couldn't do it. I almost flunked senior year. And I was going to play college golf. And to get out of senior to graduate, I had to do an oral book report in English class. And I said, I'm not doing it. And she said, well, you're not going to pass. I said, flunk me. I can't do it.
Wow.
And she let me come in after school and just do it with her because I couldn't speak in front of a group. And so that continued. I just didn't do it. I would never do it. In college, I'd get it. No, don't do that. In graduate school, no, don't do that. And then as early, in my mid-20s, I go into practice, and I'm getting asked by churches and organizations to come in and speak. And I say, no, I don't do that. I don't do that. I don't do that. Then one day I'm in the gym working out, and I'm probably 28-ish. I'm in the locker room. I'm walking to the showers, and this big naked guy walks up to me, like 10 feet tall. Well, it turns out he found out later he played defensive end for the Rams, for the Los Angeles Rams. But this big naked guy walks up to me, and out of the blue, he says, "Are you a Christian?" I said, "Yeah." I mean, this is weird. I don't know this guy from Adam. I said, "Yeah." And he said, "Well, God just told me to tell you something." And I'm like, "Well, I'm a psychologist too. I can help you with those voices that you're hearing." And he says, "No, seriously, I'm a pastor." I said, "What church?" And he told me church. It was a legitimate church. It was a Newport Vineyard. And he said, "I really did hear from God, and he wants to tell you something." I said, "Okay." So we go next door and sat down for coffee. And he said, "God told me to tell you this. Something happened to you when you were a kid, and it made you afraid to speak in front of people. And you've avoided it since then. But God wants you to begin to speak for him, and he's going to open some doors, and you are to walk through them."
Wow.
And so that's pretty hard to deny. And then the next week, I got 2 calls
To speak?
to speak.
When he said something happened to you when you were a kid, did you know right away what he was talking about, or was that something you buried?
100%.
Yeah.
100%.
Yeah.
Because I knew when all that started, because I had been fine before then. I had school plays and stuff like that. But it's just, when I wrote the book, when I say miracles, I'm not kidding. I mean, I've seen physical healings. I've seen, I'll tell you another funny one professionally is Tori and I were having dinner one night. This is a long time ago. And the phone rings. And it was a woman who was on a board that I was on that I saw twice a year. She had no idea what was going on in my life. I go to board meetings, and that's kind of all I see her. And she said, "I just had a vision about you, and the Lord has something he wants to say to you." And I said, "Really?" She said, "Yeah." I said, "What was it?" She said, "The vision was you were speaking to people in a yard, and there's a fence around the yard. And God said, as long as that fence is there, you can only speak to people in the yard, and I'm going to remove the fence because I want you to speak to people outside of the yard." Now, hit pause for a second. In the year prior to that, I had been in my prayer time hearing this not audible voice, but voice saying, "I'm taking you out of the Christian circle into the marketplace," as we call it. That was the sign. And then she said, "He's going to remove the fence." And then she says this, "You're about to sign something, and if you sign it, it will keep you in the yard, and you're not to sign it."
Wow.
It was a 5-year publishing deal with a Christian publisher. There would have just been Christian books, and I would have been locked up for 5 years, and we were about to sign it within the next few days.
Wow.
And then right after that, I said no. I mean, I couldn't do it. I mean, it was too clear. And then right after that, I don't know if you remember the Time Life commercials on TV with all the music
Yes.
offerings and stuff like that?
Yes.
Well, Time Life calls my agent. They were doing a massive, this is right after 9/11, they were doing a massive worship music offering for the masses. And around, the anchor song was "God Will Make a Way" by, I think it's Don Moen. And they wanted a book around it, How God Makes a Way. And so we did that book, and that opened up the whole, quote, secular publishing world. And then I had to change agents, and I started writing leadership books with a New York publisher, and that opened up a lot of other things. But it was from that vision that woman had, and multiple things like that over the years.
I think back to you in college walking across campus to get to the chapel, and it's like, okay, God, I'm going to give you a chance here to speak. And you got crickets in the moment.
No, there weren't even crickets. Okay. I got the
nothing.
Crickets died. Nothing.
Nada. And what you're describing now is a relationship with God that is cultivated in a way. There's a couple of things that strike me. Number one, you hear from him, which I think, some people just find that fascinating. Like, how did that happen?
Well, and by the way, it doesn't happen all the time.
Sure. Right.
It's like boom, and then crickets for a while.
But here's the other part. You trust him. There is obviously an intimacy and a trust. Like, whereas before, not hearing from him in that moment hit you one way, like, okay, well, whatever. That was my last ditch. I don't know what else to do. And now if you walk through a season of crickets or even less than that, there's like an intimacy there.
Yeah, I wouldn't want to sound, super spiritual or anything,
Yeah.
but if you have somebody that you've been through a lot with
Mm-hmm.
and you really trust them like a friend and they have your back, and then somebody comes along and says, well, so-and-so, I'm talking about your friend, said this about you or this, that, and the other, you're instantly going to feel like, no, there's something wrong with that story. That's not my friend. He wouldn't do that. And it's not. You find out later it's divisive gossip or something. But my point is, when you know them and trust them, what other noise happens outside of that relationship doesn't change the trust. And so what I've learned is that it's interesting when you go to the scriptures, every time there's a bad time, God says to the Israelites or whoever, remember when you were slaves in Egypt, remember when I did this, remember when I did this. And he's trying to get them to call on the track record of his faithfulness. Because, Paul is writing about the certainty and joy he has while he's being beaten and stoned and in prison and all of that. But learning to trust God is like any other relationship. You learn he is faithful. He doesn't own a watch. I'm going, keep looking at my watch. When are you going to show it? You're late. You're late. He's never late. How can you be late when you live outside of time? The reason we think he's late is because we're in a time that he's not in. But yeah, you're right. You develop a relationship where, as Job said, though you slay me, I will trust you. And he said, who else? And like they said, who else are we going to turn to? You have the words of eternal life. And so it's hard. I'm not, don't make that sound easy. I had a surgery gone bad a few years ago, and I was in really bad pain. I was starting to even hallucinate in the pain. It was during COVID, and they were holding off on opiates because it was in the opioid crisis and didn't have the pain medication I need. And I was really almost losing consciousness. And at those, in that, there was a time period, yeah, God, where are you? And sometimes we go through periods like that, but the longer you walk with him and the more you see his faithfulness, it changes your perspective on that. I don't know if that's quite what you're saying, but that's, yeah, there's an intimacy you develop it's like any other relationship, It's like, God, where are you? Well, we're probably the one that moved, not him. But at the same time, he does, like a good therapist. One of the things a good therapist has to learn to bring out of the person what needs to be brought out. A therapist has to learn to not answer a question and just sit in the silence. And sometimes that's the most powerful intervention in somebody's life you can do as a therapist. It's not fill up the air with a bunch of words. And I've had periods, in fact, I think I'm just now coming out of one where it seemed like for a long time, God was just silent, just silent. But he's doing something in you in those periods. So his ways are higher than ours.
One of the things that strikes me about Dr. Cloud's story is this reminder that God doesn't meet us on the other side of our pain or once we've figured everything out. He meets us in it, in the places where we're weary and frustrated and confused. If this conversation resonated with you, Henry's newest book, it's called To Know Him, a 90-day invitation to come to God as you are. It is a beautiful next step. It's a devotional, but it feels a little more like a companion, especially if you are tired and searching or learning what it looks like to come to God with honesty instead of certainty. And if you want to hear more of Henry's personal faith story, his book, Why I Believe, goes even deeper into the journey that shaped his life and his work and his trust in God. You can find more at drcloud.com. And if you're looking for genuinely wise, practical encouragement around healthy relationships, His Instagram is one of my favorites. We've linked everything in the show notes for you so you can check it out there. I am so grateful to Dr. Cloud for sharing his story with us. Hey, thanks so much for listening today. My hope is that Henry's story reminds you that healing is possible, that you're not alone, and that God will meet you exactly where you are. Well, if you would like to help this kind of inspiring storytelling grow, you can make a gift and find more stories, including our new epic podcast. It's called The Christ, coming this Easter. You can learn more at myfaithpodcasts.com. Thanks so much to the Unfolding team, Michael Shermack, and our producer and network director, Jason Rackow. We'll be back next week with Bart Millard from Mercy Me and another page in the Unfolding.